There's something about Memorial Day weekend that makes a person stop and think. Maybe it's seeing flowers at the cemetery. Maybe it's driving past a graveyard and noticing the flags blowing in the wind. Maybe it's hearing a name you haven't heard in a while. And all of a sudden, the memories come flooding back. Some memories make you smile. Some memories make you thankful. Some make you miss somebody so much it catches you off guard. And then there are other memories that are harder to explain. Because the truth is, not every person leaves behind the same kind of legacy. Some people leave behind love, sacrifice, laughter, faith, work ethic, and stories you want to tell over and over again. And some people leave behind hurt, control, unfinished conversations, children who spent their entire lives trying to be enough in the eyes of someone who is no longer here. So this Memorial Day weekend, maybe the question isn't just, who are we remembering? Maybe the question is, what are they leaving behind? And maybe even more important than that, what are we leaving behind? Welcome back to the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast, where we talk about family, farming, transition, succession, and the kind of legacy that does not just show up on paper. It shows up in how people remember you. Memorial Day is a day set aside to remember those who gave their lives in service to this country. And for many families, it also becomes a weekend where we remember loved ones who have passed on. The grandparents, parents, spouses, neighbors, veterans, and family members whose names come up when we walk through the cemetery or sit around the kitchen table. It is a weekend full of memory, but memory is complicated. We remember the ones who served. We remember the ones who sacrificed. We remember the ones who made us laugh. We remember the ones who taught us something and the ones we still wish we could call. And sometimes, if we are being honest, we remember people we are not quite sure how we want to remember them. Because not every legacy feels warm and cozy. Not every family story is simple. Not every person who is gone was easy to love while they were here. And I do not want to say this to be cold or disrespectful. I say it because it is truth and honesty. There are people who pass away and leave behind a family full of gratitude. And then there are people who pass away and leave behind a family full of questions. There are people whose headstone gets flowers because they were deeply loved. And there are people whose headstone gets polished because someone is still trying, even after all these years, to finally feel like they were enough. That is a hard pill to swallow. And say it out loud. But sometimes the hardest things are the ones we need to talk about. Every year around Memorial Day, you see people out in the cemeteries. They're trimming grass, setting flowers, washing off headstones, placing flags, and standing quietly for a minute before they leave. And there's something beautiful about that. It matters that we remember. It matters that we pause. It matters that we say, this person lived. This person mattered. This person was here. For those who served, especially those who gave everything, that remembrance is sacred. Their sacrifice shaped families, communities, and the country we live in. We should never take that lightly. But Memorial Day weekend also has a way of opening the door to other memories. You start thinking about grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, neighbors, the people who helped raise you, the people who influenced your farm, your family, your values, and your way of life. And when we remember them, we do not just remember that they existed, we remember how they made us feel. That is the part we sometimes overlook. A person can own land, they can have their name on the mailbox, they can have a nice stone in the cemetery, a person can have a long obituary. But at the end of the day, what people remember most is how that person treated them. Were they kind? Were they fair? Were they generous with their time? Did they make room for the next generation? Did they help their family grow? Or did they make everyone around them work for approval that never came? That is legacy. Legacy is not just what you leave to someone, it is what you leave in someone. There are some people you miss in a way that never really leaves. Maybe it is a spouse who was your other half. Maybe it is a parent who always knew what to say. Maybe it is a grandparent who smelled like coffee, garden dirt, diesel fuel, or fresh baked bread. Maybe it is someone who served, came home different, carried more than they ever talked about, and still showed up for their family. Those are the people whose memory feels like a blessing. You tell stories about them because you want the next generation to know who they were. You want the grandkids to know what grandpa stood for. You want the family to know how grandma held everything together. You want people to understand that this person's life mattered, not just because they lived, but because of how they loved. But then there are other people whose legacy is harder. And this is where we have to be honest without becoming bitter. There are people who were human, yes. They had their own struggles, their own upbringing, their own wounds, but they also hurt people. They were selfish. They kept their thumb on things to keep control. They held power over their family. They made the next generation feel small. They made sons or daughters feel like they were never enough. And after they are gone, sometimes the family is still living under that shadow. I've seen it happen. A son keeps trying to please a father who is no longer here. He keeps the grave looking perfect. He keeps the headstone clean, fixes the vases. He keeps showing up almost as if one more flower arrangement, one more visit, one more stitch of glue to that vase, one more act of duty will finally earn the words he never got to hear. I'm proud of you. You did a good job. You are enough. But death does not always fix what was broken in life. And that is why legacy matters so much while we are still here. Because there comes a point where remembrance should not be about pretending everything was fine and brushing it under the rug. Sometimes remembrance is about telling the truth, learning from it, breaking the family cycle, and choosing not to pass that same hurt down to one more generation. I think about couples who spent a lifetime together. You can look at two marriages from the outside, and they may both have lasted 50 or 60 years. On paper, they look the same. Long marriage, same farm, same house, same family name. But inside those houses, the stories may have looked very differently. There was one couple, we'll call them Frank and Marie. They were married a long time, more than 50 years. They built a life, raised a family, and stayed together. But towards the end, they were more like companions than sweethearts. They slept in separate rooms. They had their routines. Yeah, they lived under the same roof, but there was a distance there. When he passed away, she grieved, but she kept going. She kept doing what she had always done. She lived many more years, and she had her life and her independence. And this is not necessarily wrong. Every marriage has its own story, and every person grieves differently. But then you see another couple. I'll call them Henry and Clara. They were married more than 60 years. Same living room chairs, the same bed that they slept in, same habits and morning rituals, same coffee cups. Their lives were woven together so tightly that when one was gone, the other hardly knew how to live in silence and live without the other. So Clara passed first, and Henry was never quite the same after. Within a year or so, he was gone too. People will sometimes say Henry died of a broken heart. And maybe that is not a medical term, but we all know what it means. It means he missed her. It means the house did not feel the same without her anymore. It means the person who made life steady and whole was gone. That kind of love leaves a mark. That kind of legacy is not remembered only once a year at the cemetery. It is remembered in the stories, in our recipes, in the way the family talks about them, and in the way people say they really loved each other. And that makes me think, why do we wait until the end of May to remember people? Why do we only talk about them when we are putting flowers on a grave? If someone mattered, their memory should show up more than once a year. It should show up in how we live, in how we treat each other, in what we carry forward. And if someone left behind pain, that memory matters too. Not because we want to dwell on it, but because we want to make sure it stops with us. Now, when we talk about legacy on a farm, people usually think of land. Who gets the land? Who gets to buy the land? Who rents the land? Who gets the house, the machinery? Who gets to keep farming? But land is only part of it. The bigger question is this: what kind of family are you leaving behind when the paperwork is done? Because I know of a farm family where the older generation held on as long as they possibly could. The father would not let the son in. Well, not really. The son farmed. He worked. He helped. He waited and hoped there would be a real transition. But instead of making a clear plan, the older generation held control right up until the end. The son rented the farm for years. Then when the father was near the end of his life, he was about 91 years old, the son in his 60s finally had to buy it. So in a way, he paid for that farm twice, first through rent, then through the purchase. And you would think after living through that, a person would say, I'm not going to do that to my own son. But sometimes patterns repeat themselves. It's the history. History repeats itself. Sometimes the very thing that hurt one generation becomes the thing they turn around and do to the next generation. Not always because they mean to be cruel, but sometimes control feels so familiar. Sometimes because their ego gets involved. Sometimes because a person says, well, this is how it was done to me. That's what I'm going to do to you because I don't know any better. But this is how it was done to me is not a good enough reason to keep doing it. In this family, the next son coming up saw what was happening. He looked at the numbers, he looked at the rent, and he looked at what he would eventually have to buy. And he put his foot down and said, no, I'm not renting it now just so I can buy it again later. I'm not going to buy the farm twice. Because in farm families, saying no looks like disrespect to the older generation. But sometimes saying no is needed and is not disrespect. Sometimes saying no is that first honest business decision anybody has made in a long, long time. So the son penciled it out. He put it in black and white. He showed his parents what the going rental rate was. He showed them what he was paying other landlords and showed them that if he paid fair rent, the number would be about the same as making payments on a contract for deed. And the older generation said, oh, you would not pay that much in rent. We're not going to charge you that much in rent. And he said, that's the going rate. So once they looked at what was down in black and white, that changed the conversation. Because once the numbers were on paper, it became harder to hide behind the emotion. It became harder to say, this is just how we have always done it. A contract or deed made sense in this case. The older generation still had their security. Their names were still involved until it was paid in full. But the younger generation was no longer trapped paying rent with no ownership path, no clear plan. That is what legacy planning is supposed to do. It's supposed to create a path forward. No guessing games, no guilt trip, no power trip, just a clear plan. There's another piece of this that happens more often than people want to admit. A son or daughter moves back to the farm. Maybe they move into the old farmhouse or a house on the farmstead. They start fixing it up, they remodel it, they improve the yard, they repair buildings, they pour money, time, sweat, and years into a place they do not own. At first, everyone says, someday this will be yours. But someday is not a plan. And because they do not own it, they cannot borrow against it. They cannot get a loan for improvements. If they ask the parents to co-sign, it becomes a big issue. They were made to feel guilty for needing help, even though they were the ones improving the property that still belongs to the older generation. Maybe dad co-signed once and never lets them forget it. Maybe it was a small loan, but he talks about how far he had to stick his neck out just to co-sign. Maybe every request for help comes with shame attached. So the younger couple stops asking. They pay as they go. They do the work themselves. They put money into the house, the yard, the outbuildings, the farmstead, year after year after year. They increase the value of the place and still do not own it. Then when it finally comes time to transfer the property, an appraiser walks in and says, you cannot just give them the house. They have to buy it at market value. And now the improvements they made are counted against them. They increased the value and then they had to buy the value back? What? That is a hard pill to swallow because they did the work. They paid for the improvements. They helped the farm. They helped the parents. They helped keep things going. And then they still had to buy the house, the yard, the farm at the value their own work helped increase the value of. That is why clear planning matters. Because without that plan, the next generation is vulnerable. What happens if dad passes away, but mom lives for another 15 or 20 years? What happens if siblings decide to contest the will? What happens if the farming child has spent decades improving a home they still do not own? What happens if the family changes its mind? These are not fun questions, but they are real questions. And ignoring them does not protect the family. It usually protects the person who wants to stay in control. There is a difference between stewardship and control. Stewardship says, I want this farm to continue. I want the next generation to have a fair chance. I want to protect the land, but I also want to protect the people. Control says, I want my name on it until the day I die. I want the final say. I want everyone to need my approval. Stewardship creates peace, while control creates resentment. Stewardship prepares that next generation, and control delays the next generation and hinders them. Stewardship teaches, and control withholds information. And here is the hard truth. When you are gone, people will remember which one you chose. They may still put flowers on your grave. They may still keep the headstone clean. They may still show up on Memorial Day weekend. But what will they feel when they stand there? Will they feel gratitude? Will they feel peace? Will they feel love? Will they tell stories with a smile on their face? Or will they feel the weight of everything that was just never said, everything that was never fixed, never made right? That is not meant to be harsh. It's meant to be a reminder to all of you as listeners. We are all writing our legacy right now, not someday, not when the estate plan is finished, not when the will is read, right now. We write it in how we talk to our kids. We write it in how we treat our in-laws. We write it in whether we make the next generation beg for clarification. We write it in whether we use land as a gift or as a weapon. We write it in whether we can admit the way it was done to me was wrong, and I am not going to repeat it. The cycle stops here. Memorial Day is about remembering those who have passed, but maybe one of the best ways to honor the dead is to pay attention to the living. Call the person you keep meaning to call. Tell the story before no one remembers it anymore. Ask the question while someone is still here to answer it. Say thank you. Say I am sorry. Say I'm proud of you. Say here is the plan and I want you to understand it, because someday every one of us will be remembered by somebody. Maybe by our children, maybe by our grandchildren, nieces and nephews, neighbors, maybe by the next person who farms the land we once farmed. And the question is not whether they will remember us. The question is how. Will they remember us as someone who made life easier or harder? Will they remember us as someone who opened doors or blocked them? Will they remember us as someone who loved well? Or will they remember us as someone who served? Will they remember us as someone who could be counted on? Or will they remember us as someone they spent their entire life trying to please? That's a sobering thought, but it is also a hopeful one. Because if we're still here, we still have time. We can change that conversation. We can put things in writing. We can stop repeating old patterns. We can choose fairness over control. We can choose clarity over confusion. We can choose love over ego. And we can build a legacy that people do not just maintain out of obligation, but remember with gratitude. This Memorial Day weekend, as you drive by the cemeteries, As you see the flags, as you see the flowers, take a moment to remember. Remember the ones who served, who sacrificed, the ones who loved you well. Remember the ones you still miss. Remember the ones whose stories deserve to be told. And for the harder memories, maybe do not bury them. Learn from them. You do not have to pretend every relationship was perfect in order to be respectful. You do not have to call something healthy when it was clearly not. You do not have to carry forward a legacy of control just because that is what was handed to you. Some people leave an example. Some people leave a warning. Both can teach us something, but here's the part where we get to decide, what will we leave? At the end of the day, a legacy is not measured by how long your name stayed on the deed, how polished your headstone is, or how many flowers are placed there once a year. At the end of the day, your legacy is measured by whether the people who come after you can remember you with peace. Thanks for joining me on the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast. If this episode made you think about your own farm's future, consider sharing it with a family member or a friend who could use the help. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that matter the most. And if you'd like to set up a 30-minute discovery call, contact me at pathfinderlegacy.com. Until next time, I'll see you between the ditches.
Thanks for listening to the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast, where your future is our focus. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media, and visit us at pathfinderlegacy.com to start building your transition plan today.